Let's begin by invoking npx create react app to create a new React application that we'll use for the basis of the UI extension tutorial throughout this video. We're going to be creating a search engine results preview UI extension, and this looks a little bit like this on Google if you haven't seen it before. When we are editing content, we want to be able to see what this will look like in Google right alongside when we are creating content inside of GraphCMS. We can use UI extensions to do this. Now that it's installed, let's change directory into that. Then let's open this inside of our code editor. Now inside of my code editor, I'm going to open the main app.js file. I'm not really too concerned what is in this file. At the moment, I just kind of want to return a new component that we'll use for the basis of this UI extension. This component doesn't exist, but we'll import it from the same directory that we are in currently, and we'll go ahead and create that and export a default function from that file. So I'm just going to give this a name of Google SERP preview.js, and inside of here we can export a default function. Also inside of this file, we'll create a function called SERP preview, and this will just return some text. Now we've done this, let's go ahead and install the UI extensions library from GraphCMS. Once that's installed, we're going to import two things from the UI extension library. We're going to import a wrapper, and then we are going to import a React hook from the UI extension library. Now inside of the SERP preview function, let's invoke that use UI extension hook that we imported from the GraphCMS UI extensions library. From this, I want to destructure extension. And this will allow us to get the things like the name, description, and anything else, such as config, which we'll configure later. Then inside of this hello world, we can replace the contents of the H1 here to simply include the name of that extension. Then further down where we invoke that plugin above, we'll need to import the wrapper component and invoke that here, and then we can pass that component inside of there. Wrapper also takes a declaration, and this declaration is something that we'll need to declare above, and this is what is used when installing the plugin with GraphCMS. We'll now go ahead and configure the declaration object for our UI extension. We need to declare the extension type, and in this case we'll choose form sidebar because we want to show this preview in the sidebar when editing content within GraphCMS. We'll need to give this a name so when we install it, we know exactly what we are installing, and when we are using this as a widget, we can configure this and add this to any one of our models, and we know exactly which one it is that we are working with. And the same goes for description. This makes it a lot easier to see when we are managing that widget. There's a lot more configuration options that we'll need to add in just a little bit to this declaration, but for now, we'll stick with that so we can get going and see what this looks like inside of GraphCMS. You might be thinking at this point that returning a H1 on the page is not all too exciting. So why don't we go ahead and mimic the actual representation of Google inside of GraphCMS? What we'll do is specify some inline styles just to give some color to our text and also the font size just to mimic what Google actually represents. We'll leave website.com here and we'll configure that in just a moment. But with the title, let's go ahead and actually render the extension name. And then where we have a description, we'll render the extension description. We'll then go ahead and start the server. This will launch on localhost 3000. Once that's running, we can then move over to GraphCMS. And here I have a project which has a model for our blog post. Right now it has the fields title and excerpt. Inside of my project settings, I want to go to UI extensions where it has this preview tab, and then we want to install a new UI extension. So I'm just going to type in the localhost 3000 address that I have running for my React app. We can see here that the declaration was successfully picked up and the plugin is all ready and can be installed. If we scroll down here, we can see that we have a extension display name and the description as well as a API ID defined. And we can see here the preview of this. This is what we specified as a title and description inside of that declaration config. Now if we go ahead and authorize and install, this will save to your GraphCMS account. This is using the localhost 3000 version, so it's important if you are building your UI extension that your UI extension code is running on localhost 3000 or wherever you installed it. Next, let's go to the schema for the blog post. We'll notice here at the top we have fields and sidebar. If we click on sidebar, we can see all of the available widgets that are currently in use. And if we notice on the right hand side, we can see this custom widget that we've just configured as a UI extension. If we go ahead and click on this, we can see here that we can set a display name and a description. Now, if we create this, this will be added to the blog post. And now if we go ahead to create some content for the blog post, what we should see when we create a new content item for blog post is that we now have that custom widget on the right hand side. Now if we add some text in here, hello world, and a description. What we'd next like to do is have this appear inside of this text here, and the excerpt also appear below. And we can do that using React inside of our UI extension. One of the first things that I'd like to explore is how we can configure something like website.com here to be something that is given from the plugin configuration itself. So when we declared all of these settings for the UI extension, we give it a extension type, name, and description, and those are what we can get from the extension like we have here for the name and description. But what if we wanted to store some configuration that we asked users for when they were configuring the widget in their sidebar, or when they installed the plugin itself? Let's have a look at how we can configure something in the plugin itself. When we instantiate, when we authorize and install a plugin, we want to provide a site URL. Now we have the site URL, what we want to do is actually get from extension the config that we've just given. So we'll declare a new constant by destructuring config from extension. Then from config, we can fetch the site URL. Then the site URL value, we can update and replace website.com here to include the contents of site URL. If we load our application and go back to where we configured the UI extension and edit this, you'll now see at the bottom of here, we have a field for site URL. If we lose focus or try to update this, you'll notice that this is a required field, and it's a string and has this label here, site URL. And that is what we configured back inside of the declaration. If we give this value here of GraphCMS.com and we update, if we then go back to a content entry and we create a new one, you'll now see the value GraphCMS.com is coming from the configuration of that installed UI extension. We'll next go ahead and import useState and useEffect. We'll use these within our UI extension component. So that we can listen to changes that happen within our content form, we'll need to fetch form from the use UI extension hook, and from that we can also destructure subscribe to field state. With this subscribe to field state, we can use a useEffect hook whenever the title or the description changes in the value of the form. We'll then call setTitle and setDescription for our local useState. Let's first define the title and description, as well as the setter for setTitle and setDescription. I've added some default values here for both of these fields, so those will show inside the UI extension when you have nothing inside of your content entry. You can customize these, make these empty, do whatever you like. Next, let's add the two use effects for subscribing to changes that happen on our title field and the description field. Here we are creating a unsubscribe async function. Inside of here, that allows us to await subscribe to field state. This takes in a few arguments. The first argument will be the config title that we set when we add this UI extension to one of our sidebars in our schema. Then the second, we can call setTitle using the state that's passed, and we can call state.value to do so. Then we'll pass value to true, so we get the value of that state. Then when this component unmounts, we simply want to clean things up, so we just return that unsubscribe function. And we'll only ever call any of this code when this value here or this value here changes. We'll do the same for description, and next we need to declare the configuration for both the description field and title. We're using sidebar configuration, so this sidebar UI extension can be reusable across multiple models. If we simply remove this value here and said this would be a description or a excerpt, this would only ever work for models that have those fields. But we want to make this more reusable, so when we configure the sidebar extension, we can give it all of the fields that it needs. Next, if we scroll down where we have extension name, let's update this to be the title and the description from the useState. If we go back up, we can see here that we have title and description. And whenever anything in here changes or is called, this will update this value here using setTitle or setDescription. So next, inside of our declaration for our UI extension, outside of config, let's declare sidebar config. We'll set the title field and description field, and we'll make both of those types a string, and we'll give it a display name and set that this field is required. The last thing that we need to do is destructure sidebar config from the actual UI extension. If we go above, after form, let's destructure sidebar config from this hook use UI extension. Then, because we've changed the declaration of our UI extension, we need to refresh the UI extension itself. So if we head on over to the UI extension, and we come in here and we update this, this will refresh the sidebar extension. Then if we configure the widget that we have installed, you'll now see that we have two fields for our title and description. I've added two fields here for the title and excerpt, and these match the fields that we have inside of the schema for our blog post. Now if we begin to type in the title field, we'll see on the right hand side that we have the title automatically shown to us in the SERP preview component. And if we add an excerpt, that will also update the description field in here. We can then save this content entry, and whenever we edit this in the future, the preview will always be updated with whatever we type inside of here. So there we have it, a sidebar extension that we created using the GraphCMS UI extensions React library that we built on our local machine, and we were able to preview inside of the GraphCMS web app. The next steps would be to deploy this so other users of your GraphCMS project can also use this new UI extension that you've just created. We have guides on how you can deploy this to Vercel, Netlify, and many others, so check out the documentation which will show you how to get started with UI extensions and working with them. All of the code that we've seen throughout this tutorial can be found on GitHub inside of our GraphCMS examples repo, and we encourage you to contribute your own if you have any great UI extensions that you want to share with the community.